Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Trice. I'm with Better Food Ventures, based out here in California. We focus on the application of information technology and make investments in companies that are applying IT across the food and ag ecosystem. I'm really pleased to have a fantastic panel today. What we really want to look at is can the Delta become the next California? That may seem like a bit of an odd title, so let me set the context. So one of our panelists and I are both out in California, AG Kawamura. Out here in the land of fruits and nuts, we grow over 400 different crops, but it's getting harder and harder to do so. And so whether that's climate variability, regulation, overpopulation, fighting for resources, all these things are making it harder in traditional places where we grow crops. And this might create an opportunity for the Delta, and that's what we really want to explore with our panel today. So let's start off with some quick introductions. So John Butler, the man in the white hat here to save the Delta, is the CEO of Agriculture International. AG Kawamura is the former California Secretary of Department of Food and Agriculture. More importantly, he is an urban farmer. And what I mean by that is he has been he and his family have been a multi-generational farmer, and the urban areas have grown up around his farms in Orange County, California. Julia Kurnik is the Director of Innovation Startups at World Wildlife Fund. And Pete Nelson is the President and Executive Director of AgLaunch. Julia, I'm going to ask you to kind of help set the table for us here. Your organization wrote a report called The Next California. Can you give us a little bit of background on that report?
Absolutely. And thank you very much, Rob, and for Crusonia for having all of us here today. Uh, you know, I realize it's a little strange sometimes to hear the World Wildlife Fund is looking at agriculture in the mid-Mississippi Delta. But what we see is that, California has been dominating the production of specialty crops in this country, so fruits, vegetables, and nuts, for quite a while. But as you mentioned, Rob, it's becoming increasingly unsustainable, and between higher heat, increased droughts, fires, and other causes that we can get into, we don't expect California to stop being an agricultural state. That's not our goal. That's not what we're looking for. But we do expect that farmers there will have to decide what they want to focus on and perhaps narrow what they grow. So we wanted to see if we could proactively help shift farming, take some of that pressure off of California, and move it to an area that's good for the environment, good for the local region, and good for farmers and businesses. And we really believe that the mid-Mississippi Delta is one of those regions. And I know we'll go through it in a bit more detail, but we were really attracted for the long history of farming that has been there, that it's, fantastic farmers and network, fertile soils. It's already farmland. It's just commodity row crops largely instead of specialty crops, and all of the infrastructure and supports there, but also the chance to build a new system, really from scratch in a way to bring higher value crops, to bring value added processing, to create new jobs, and to hopefully build it in a way that is healthy and equitable as well.
Fantastic. And Pete, I also want you to make mention, if you would, of the MidSouth Delta Food Cluster and that report. Kind of give us the background on that a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, everyone on this call is passionate about agriculture and doing that in our unique geographic context. So for the Delta, we grow 6 or 7 of the major commodity crops. But unlike other regions where there's heavy processing, virtually all those crops go right on the river on a barge and are shipped out of here. So the economic impact, the equitable creation of jobs doesn't necessarily correlate to the commodities. So many of us for maybe over 10 years now have been figuring out what could we possibly do to diversify the crop base. And what we realized is you can't just plop a new crop in to an already mature economic system in crop rotation. So we set out now about 5 years ago, working with a series of consultants to look at the overall 15 million acres and develop a strategy. And I think we'll have a little opportunity to talk more about that, but we pulled stakeholders together and then lay out a strategy that how do we help commodity crop farmers where they are now? How do we help them to create more value-added products with what they're currently growing, and then ultimately use the technology and the ecosystem we've built to diversify into other types of species and crops, with the ultimate goal of being the best place in the world for growing all sorts of new funky things that we don't grow yet. And that's the World Wildlife Foundation has fit perfectly in that with us in terms of just that shared vision, which our farmers also thought it was a little strange. We're working together, Julia, but it's a common goal that really is not exclusive of others, but really creates a more robust overall ecosystem in the U.S. for agriculture.
Excellent. So what I've challenged our panel to do here is have a conversation in the framework of a classic SWOT analysis that you might run across in a business school class or something. What I mean by that, of course, is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. I made a slight modification because I want to bundle up the weaknesses and threats and use the term that the WWF described in their report, what they called hurdles. But let's start with strengths. So maybe John, maybe I can ask you to step in a little bit, just kick us off with a little bit of discussion about strengths. Why do we think it's viable that the Delta might start to look more like California?
You bet. So first, I want to just welcome everybody, especially the Crusonia team, and how much I've appreciated being involved with their project over the last couple of years. And I think all of us in Memphis can certainly relate to the strengths that we've seen over our last couple of decades. And first and foremost, it starts with farmers like me. We are entrepreneurs. We all understand our roles, and we're very, I think, flexible as we approach the future. One of the challenges I think that we've seen over the last couple of years, especially as farm gate revenue has declined for the 6th year in a row, we've also seen Chapter 12 bankruptcy filings increase for the region. We've got to improvise. We've got to make that transition, and that's one of the reasons why I really was attracted to the job here at Agricenter International, because we have the ability to step into that role and do some innovation and some creativity around investigating what new crops look like. And I think Pete's exactly right. And Pete and I work together almost on a daily basis, probably more than either one of us want to admit. And I want to thank Julia for the work. So to come in and kind of bring a spotlight to that, I think really has been important for all of us. And so sometimes it takes somebody to kind of come in and create some of the thought process around why a particular region or a group of people can be successful. But the main asset is our farmers. And I think second and third, you would go straight to the land, the available resource, the flexibility. So within a 100-mile radius, you have about 1,200 ag and food companies that can grow almost anything from peanuts to sweet potatoes in the region. We also have the ability that what Pete mentioned is that to hit the river and be very efficient in our transportation, but that benefit for some reason over the last couple of years has kind of, I think, turned against us in one way. I think it's kind of stifled creativity. It's stifled our ability to look outside our traditional roles. And one of the things that we've done here at AgriCenter is that we've got the largest hops yard in the Delta. Now, that doesn't mean hops is going to take the place of corn or rice or soy in our product rotation mix. What it does mean is that it could certainly fit for small to medium-sized producers, but hops is just one example of maybe 50 or 60 or 150 different crops or commodities that can transition here and be successful.
That's excellent. So I got farmers in the need to change, land resources and other resource availability. We've already got some crop availability, access to transportation and logistics. What else we got? Pete, Julia, anything to add there?
Yeah, John, this is Pete. John commented on the logistics, and we've got these food companies, but when we did our study, we benchmarked the fact that out of the top 10 food production areas in context of an urban food production area, we're the only one that has excess capacity. So that's people capacity, infrastructure capacity. And so we actually can produce a lot more food here. And again, what is happening now is we're producing commodities. They're going on a barge, and then we're shipping ingredients back in for the 1,000 food companies that are in the region. So pulling that supply chain together should be sort of a slam dunk, even as we kind of think about more diverse or more interesting products and ingredients going forward. So that one's key. The fact that in the Delta, we have 5 major land-grant universities research centers, all operating really around the Delta as opposed to where their geographical head is. So for example, we have the University of Tennessee 400 miles away from here in Knoxville, but their experiment stations that work on this kind of work are here. Same thing with Mizzou and with Mississippi State. So you've got a natural synergy of PhDs working on agronomy and seed and breeding issues, but they are not centered in the typical land-grant university mentality in terms of innovation. And so that's one. And then we've got one that most folks probably wouldn't see as an asset, but is, and that is we don't have a large incumbent here. I think there was a discussion earlier about an Indigo. One reason Indigo came is because they didn't have to sit in Indianapolis or somewhere right next to a Corteva or a Dow or a Bayer. And so when you do innovation, that seems like that's not an advantage, but we literally have this highly productive area without a lot of incumbents that we can afford to dream a little bit and build a little bit, which is seems like not an advantage to not have a major university sitting here and not have a major company sitting here, but it's actually turned into quite the advantage as we looked at disruptive technologies around autonomy, AI, all the other things that we're actually doing with farmers in the field right now.
I want to throw one out, which I think, which is compared to California, for instance, the outsized role that agriculture already plays as a percentage of GDP, as opposed to California. I think agriculture is 2% of the GDP of California. We're fighting against high tech and Hollywood. And I think that that's another opportunity. Who else? AG, Julia, anything more to add on the strengths? If not, go ahead, Julia.
I would add one more, I think, that has become more apparent this year. So if you're looking at my report, for example, it was mentioned, I think, as a sentence, is the chance for diversified supply chains. And so, as I mentioned, we expect California to continue to be an agricultural state. I think this can be complementary, but we've also seen this year how fragile supply chains are and how easily they can be broken. And as I certainly hear when I speak to potential large markets, is that the ability to perhaps source from the Delta for the eastern half of the US and from California for the western half of the US and things like that, and having that backup would be a huge bonus to them. So I think it's beyond the transportation that's already located in the region, the ability to get to the eastern half of the US and have that balance.
Excellent.
Rob, there's one more that centers back to our cotton industry, and that we have now the work that's been done with field to market and coming up with common sustainability metrics that have really not been able to get traction in the other commodities very well, because farmers and the processors, the different groups are a lot more decoupled than we are in cotton. But we now are implementing the third year of the Cotton Trust Protocol, where we have 9 attributes ranging from worker well-being to reducing inputs to sequestering carbon that we're actually measuring as an industry. And so that's one that, again, might not come like right to the surface. If you're thinking about that from an innovation perspective, it's leading this effort to not just evaluate crops based on Chicago board price times yield minus inputs, but to think about whole farm systems. So just building even on that old crop we had, but around this Cotton Trust Protocol is positioning us in a way that, Julia, when we started talking about this, we didn't really fully realize it the way we do now, is we're now measuring the kind of things that are going to lead to how we value farms in the future in a different way.
And I was actually on a discussion yesterday with Larkin Martin, who is in the cotton space, talking about, that cotton actually, despite the small size, I think there's 1,500 gins, and that's it. We have data interoperability, data standards, and that is sorely lacking in agriculture. And that might be a way that we can move forward. Okay, AG, you've been ominously quiet, and I want to pivot now to the weaknesses and threats. So can you talk about, or those hurdles for the Delta region? What do you
Sure, go ahead. Well, in using that word pivot and turn, I think that's an important thing for agriculture today writ large, is so many areas, whether you're in Florida, whether you're in California, you're trying to figure out how do you stay in business. One of the attributes that wasn't mentioned is for the Delta is they certainly have a lower minimum wage than many of the other states in the nation. And while that is an advantage, you're of course very close to Mexico, and there's a whole different wage structure there that is driving so many of the labor intensive crops out of the country and down into Mexico, for the very reason that it's hard to compete if we're nothing more than replaceable suppliers with the with those crops that we have. If you can't create diversification, if you can't create some kind of a market demand, some kind of a push, that makes it very difficult. Now, we know that some of the biggest attributes that we all have in common: soil. It was mentioned, you even have land grant systems that are in place. You have transportation, you have distribution hubs. We understand that, I would understand that we have this structure set up nicely for a pivot and turn in the Delta. One of the biggest challenges, of course, and it's one of the reasons that has plagued many of the guys, is the weather in the Delta is so much different than that of California. And while California has a Mediterranean climate, don't be fooled into thinking it's all the same. We have tremendous microclimates within California. I farm on the coast, and just 20, 30 miles inland, it's a completely different climate structure. And a lot of times you find, as a farmer, I think I'm a strawberry grower, for example, if I go 30 miles inland, I'll find myself stuck in a place trying to put a round peg in a square hole. And we watch growers go to these different districts thinking they can grow the same crop away from the coast where it's a more moderate climate, and they get clobbered by more extreme weather. So it might be hotter, it might be colder, it might be windier. All those things come into play for us. But when you get down into the Delta, one of the biggest challenges is the amount of rain that shows up. So if you're outdoors and you have a labor-intensive crop, and you also have a lot of high humidity, that obviously invites a lot of different problems with diseases and pests. It also creates a challenge for calling up and telling your buyers today that you couldn't get in the field because it's raining for 2 or 3 days straight. That's where this opportunity for closed environment agriculture and a little bit more protected agriculture comes into play. And you see that taking place all over the world. The Netherlands probably being the best example of a closed environment food system that has year-round capacity. One of the challenges we have in California is seasonality. We definitely have seasons starting from the south going up to the north, and because California is a long, skinny state, we say that, oh, look, we have year-round production, but it's not year-round production in one area. You have to move north and south depending on the season. You're growing stuff out in the desert, in the down here in the desert in the dead of winter. It's beautiful temperatures, but it's cold up north. In the Delta, I understand you can get tremendous freezes that are just crippling for some of the crops you might want to grow. And even if you don't lose the crops, a lot of the crops that would bolt would go to seed because of a sharp frost or sharp, tough weather. Those make it difficult to grow, whether it's celery, whether it's lettuce, whether it's some of these crops that will act differently when you put too much stress on them. So the liabilities, if you will, or the challenges of growing crops in the Delta, you can certainly grow almost anything in the Delta during a certain season, during a certain period of time. Can you get long time seasonality out of that area? Can you go year round? And in my mind, the easiest way to go year round is you have to move indoors, and you have to basically create your own environmentally protected, environmentally controlled growing situation. And you see that happening with whether it's Walmart or Costco or some of the other guys starting to look at already tomatoes, lettuce, indoor production year round next to the distribution center. That's not going to change. And as we move towards robotics, that will make it even better. The one thing I would also add, those regions, whether it's California, whether it's the Delta, whether it's anywhere else, where you can create the least costly energy, renewable energy, or whatever energy to drive your robotic systems, to drive your indoor weather controlled, energy intense systems. When you can create a region or a block that's working collaboratively together with collaborative innovation so that you have cheap water, cheap rent, cheap labor, cheap or advanced technologies driven by a very cheap energy system, that sets you up for a chance to change your food system.
Okay, now AG, you cheated a little bit. You jumped ahead to opportunities, right?
I probably did.
Roll back the tape just a little bit and focus on those hurdles, but that was good. And I think that issue about weather is really important. Pete, I want to call on you a little bit because I'm a little bit confused here. So we've talked about labor availability, but you also had talked about the lack of automation. So what's the deal? Is this a pro or a con, the labor situation in the Delta?
You know, when we threw out this idea of being a parallel with California and operating with specialty crops at that scale, that, you know, intuitively means we're going to have either a widespread labor pool, which right now does not exist, or a replacement for that. And this is where we have to get into the discussion on sort of the lack of the equitable past here and how we move that forward. So as an organization, we're focused on creating value and wealth for everybody that could be involved in the industry, including the 66% of African American people that are in Memphis. And part of that is not rebuilding things that look like our past here. And so, without saying about what anybody else is doing, we feel like that is one of the two major hindrances. Is you're not going to, I mean, I've been through the Valley in California, you all are all through it. I don't think we're going to rebuild a system that looks like that at a widespread scale, where you can have a company that's all they do is haul porta-johns around in order to fit laborers that are in the field. So we feel like the biggest barrier is this highly complex problem of how do you pick a tomato or a berry or something that none of it's homogenized. It all is very, very hard to keep fresh and whole, and how to do that. And that does not mean, you know, these are not absolutes. That does not mean, just like we do right now in the sweet potato industry, that we're not using labor on the field level. What it means is we have a clean slate to build from, and we're not going to build an industry here fundamentally that's what we're building on, that kind of labor in a widespread like you would see in California. I just fundamentally don't believe that's the way that we're going to be able to get investment and build and grow it. So that's, you know, that's one of the biggest hindrances to making this work in our view. And there's some things we can do as we leap along. You know, some of our partners have transitioned from row crops into blackberries, and they're using some automation and some labor. So again, you know, we're farmers. We're going to figure out ways to do it. But in terms of working through a widespread labor pool at the scale you'd have to have, we're going to have to make a bet on technology before we push on doing that in our view.
Yep. John or Julia, I've got one that I'll throw out there. Maybe you comment on that or take it somewhere else, which is lack of funding. So, you know, one of the secrets about Napa and Sonoma wineries is we had tech money that went in and created a lot of those fancy vineyards. You may not have that same opportunity. At any rate, you want to talk about funding, lack of funding, and or other hurdles?
Hey, I'll let Julia answer the lack of funding. What I'd like to I don't know if we've talked about our water asset or not. So I don't know. We're sitting right here over the Memphis Sands aquifer, and I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned the fact that because of that resource, I think it does give us a leg up to other regions of the country, like maybe in, you know, the Southwest or even the West. To address a couple of comments that AG said once, I still remember the first time I saw the San Joaquin Valley. It was the early 90s. And I thought, wow. So they do have some tremendous assets. But one of the things I think that's really caused some issues for them over the last couple of years is regulations. And that's one thing we haven't talked about yet. I think we have some advantages. I think most of our Delta states have really pro-agriculture laws in place. I know the state of Tennessee has a right to farm law that gives us the ability to operate our businesses. And so I think that's a huge advantage for us. And then one of the things that I've noticed that's really been, I think on my recent trip out to California in the last 2 years, is that urban sprawl has really impacted, and I'm sure AG can talk more about that, but it's really impacted the way their businesses can grow, and also where that growth is realistic. So for instance, if I have a farm, but it's much more economically, you know, viable for me to allow that to go into development or some type of residential homes, then that argument is really hard to listen to when I'm really struggling on, you know, the farm side P&L. And so I really believe that urban sprawl and regulations are two things because of the rural nature of the majority of the land that rests here in the Delta. I think those are things that really give us a leg up.
So usually when we talk about these topics with AG about urban pressures and regulatory constraints, you usually have to have a stiff drink in hand with him. AG, I don't. Well, can you just tell one.
Maybe in 3 hours.
Could you give one good vignette of something silly that you've had to do because of your urban pressures, for instance?
Well, we have so many challenges when we farm right up to the backyard of somebody. And so we have neighbors complaining about dust, about starting too early, about your tractors making too much noise in the morning. We have challenges where someone says they don't like to look at the toilets outside, or even the lunch wagon, because it bothers them. And yet there might have been a orange grove just 10 years earlier at their backyard. They were the ones complaining about pesticide spray and everything else. So our goal, our challenges here is very true. California has some of the most burdensome regulatory system at the state level, at the county level, and now it's starting to move down into municipal level, where you have city councils trying to tell you what you can and can't do and tell you how to grow things. Don't forget, we also have some of the highest insurance rates and taxes here. And so all of those are really creating a crunch for many of the producers here. And we're trying to adjust and pivot to just those challenges, including more and more mechanization, more and more movement towards if you will, and it's going to happen much quicker than I think anybody knows, a roboticized future for much of the industry where you're able to do that. But I would agree that the ability in the Delta, for example, to find those crops that fit, that niche crops, and more importantly, that marketing plan that can be aligned with the different processors specifically, or the chain stores themselves. After all, for many of us, we will all, at least most of us, many of us believe, certainly with my company, it's true, marketing it drives our production. We have to be able to know that we marketed the product before we even grew it, before we put that investment in and start to move forward. We can't anymore. We can't just grow something and hope we can sell it. So it's really important to recognize that structure, with the support from either the food service, there's some novel new opportunities with food banks and schools, basically having you custom grow food for the food bank, custom grow food for the school cafeteria, for the commissary. These are new models that actually open up a great opportunity area for new farming and new food system delivery, where you kind of, it's a parallel system. That farm to family system that was put together here during the pandemic is an amazing concept that it works really, really well. And you could get diversified products from a region and put them into that box, have that someone consolidate those boxes and get the best, freshest produce to those that are most in need of a nutrient-dense meal.
Okay, so AG is obviously an optimist to California because he likes to go straight to the opportunities. Julia, I want to give you the opportunity either to put a bow on our hurdles discussion, or give us the opportunity to segue off of the negative and then start talking about opportunities.
Well, what I was going to say fits both. So you gave me the perfect opening without knowing it. You brought up funding. This is, something that certainly comes up. I would say it's probably not the biggest hurdle. I would agree with Pete that I think that labor is absolutely the key issue here, and one that needs to be thought through carefully. I think when it comes to funding, while I don't want to say it's simple and doesn't matter. I think that if we can show that this will happen, if markets want to buy it, that farmers want to grow this, that this can happen, that funding will come. But I think it also presents an opportunity here to think about what that can look like and how can we do that creatively to be more equitable, to be more inclusive, and to keep more gains in the region. And so things like, in addition to growing higher value crops, can you build the processing facilities and capture the economics of the value added processing in the region as opposed to shipping product out of the region to be processed? And I think the gains there bring not only the industry that would develop around that, but that's where I think you see the desirable jobs. When I mentioned jobs at the beginning and being able to bring those to the region, I don't think it's the ones in the field picking that are the best jobs to be created, but the ones in industry that are less labor intensive, less hard on people, physically demanding, and can provide a secure environment, can provide benefits, can provide year-round employment. But as we're funding those, as you're looking at how funding can come in to build value-added processing, that's where I know we hope to bring some value add and be helpful of, can we get, investor, can it be funded through social impact bonds that we can bring to the table, or impact investors who perhaps want to create it in a way that farmers can get some of those gains as well, that they can fund it and earn equity, that workers at those plants can earn equity, that there can be specific programs to employ hard to employ populations. And so different ways of designing this from the beginning. And then so I think it can be seen as a hurdle, but I think can really be an opportunity too.
I think
Can I
you're,
address funding too, Rob, real quick?
go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, and just a good plan will attract funding. There's no doubt about that. We have a real need, high poverty area. And the way that we're doing that as a region is targeting what I would say are the non-obvious. Who has a reason to invest here? A good example, that's the farm credit system. They loan over 40% of the farm loans in this country. We've gone after them saying, will you work with us to fund our innovation engine? So starting with a $31 million fund with 8 farm credit banks, we've now mobilized funds across the Midwest to $500 million, pulling the farm credit system into funding the front end, the innovation piece, leading to the stuff Julia's talking about. So it's a hurdle, but we're executing a strategy here that's highly compelling. If you're a food company, if you're a cosmetic company in Europe, and you want a natural ingredient traceable from the microbiome to your shelf, we're positioning ourselves to do that, and it's a highly investable opportunity. So I just don't want to go by the funding discussion without going, we're open for business and are actually mobilizing millions and millions of dollars into this right now to build what we think is this innovation pipeline.
Yeah, I also want to just, I don't want to be Captain Obvious, but I want to state one of the advantages the Delta has is it doesn't have that existing infrastructure, that legacy to overcome. And that allows you to, engage financial innovations as well as technology innovations that might be harder to overcome because we have that big legacy out in California. Who else on the opportunity?
Rob,
Yep.
one of the things that I know when we talk about my group solutions from the land, we're always talking about that toolbox. What's in your toolbox and how robust is that toolbox? In the area of labor, it is true. As we hopefully get immigration reform, but more importantly, with the H-2A program that exists today, one of the things I would observe is the Delta, the cost of living in the Delta, and be able to create housing and have a program. If you have labor shortage, the H-2A program allows you to quickly adjust and pivot and turn to find a good workforce that can move into an area, and providing housing and all those different things that is really hard to do in California. It'd be very easy to say that it's an easier step forward in the Delta, and the other folks with us on the panel could attest to that. It's just a different level of overhead cost that's thrown at you when you're starting to crank up a new endeavor.
Yep.
I think that's totally right. Before we move off the hurdle, the biggest one, and I've continued to kind of bring that up, to us is price transparency. I mean, you are either putting a commodity on the Chicago board, in which we can look at it, and the game is how do you control supply at the basis, with the grain companies at the river, or it's contracted. I mean, and you all in California are great at it. You have a highly consolidated industry around Driscoll's and Taylor and others that write contracts. Well, if you can ever get beyond that, where you actually have a transparent market, probably using things like we talked about in the cotton industry, distributed ledger, there's other tools that we're bringing to bear. Right now, we grow way more vegetables if we weren't concerned about the fact that we're having to be, once again, the price takers and not part of the process. And we obviously all have the problem of how do we value special attributes. So that's for us, it's labor and price transparency and market making are the two biggest barriers. The cash will follow if you could figure out those two, which obviously we're actively working on programs around those.
Hey, I want to jump
in that. I'm sorry, Rob. I think de-risking that for producer is going to be incredibly important. So as a producer, I am risk tolerant, but there's a certain amount of risk that I can balance in my portfolio.
Yeah.
Or organizations like Agricenter or AgLaunch or land grant universities, they've got to all pitch in and take a role in de-risking that adventure, de-risking that to producers, and then hopefully creating opportunities around new genetics, new crops, new products, and are able to invest that back into the region. that, de-risking that's going to be really important for the future.
Yeah, we're running out of time a little bit. I do want to make sure that we take some questions. We got one specifically looking at the role of vertical farming. AG, you talked about indoor. I think we have to make that distinction between greenhouse or under glass and vertical, which would probably be more urban, or hybrids that might be both vertical and horizontal. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's they're talking about all those new technologies, the new systems that exist, whether it's hydroponic, aeroponic, aquaponics. They require tremendous investment, but once they're up and running, they have an opportunity to create a steady flow of supply. I think I wanted to go back to that challenge of when you have variable weather on a regular basis, and in other words, constant rains that can shut you down for days at a time. That's the one thing that generally we kind of avoid in California is this stable weather patterns that allow us to have these highly perishable crops out there. Those crops that are sturdier and hardier, obviously they find their place in operations out there like that. And going vertical allows you to measure not in square feet, but in cubic feet. Production for cubic feet, once you go vertical, is really pretty amazing how that works. And so whether it's with these the indoor tomato production that we've seen just take over the fresh tomato market in many ways, and now we're seeing lettuces as well. They can be grown indoors or outdoors. And by going above ground, one observation we've had here in our area with above ground, they can take the heat a lot better, interestingly, if you come above ground.
Yeah. I tell you what, we're running out of time here. I think I want to wrap it up and trying to look for a thumbs up affirmation from you on what I think I'm hearing. One of the things that we didn't really talk about is that it's too black and white to make it look like it's California versus the Delta. If you look at those big California, you mentioned the Driscolls, for instance, those folks, those operations already have, Taylor Farms in Arizona, Driscolls all over the place, Morocco, Australia. They're looking for international markets already and domestic markets. They're growing in new places. So it doesn't have to be an either or, right? It can be 1 + 1 = 3 here. I see a thumbs up. Everyone agree with that statement? All right. The second thing I'd like to make sure is what I'm hearing is that there's an opportunity for the Delta to look more like California, but we probably don't expect it to be an identical twin. That there's going to be variances because of the things that, for instance, AG was mentioning on the weather side, the labor and so forth, that are going to make it unique. Yet it probably will look more like California. How about that? A thumbs up? Anyone disagree? AG?
I would say it's not only not a twin, that our future depends on the way we exchange and work together. This is about spreading out risk among different geographies. AgLaunch has gone as far as we actually have a strong farm cooperative partner in Iowa, and then a partner in the Willamette Valley that's 350 crops on 3 counties, $5 billion farm gate revenue, because we're sending innovation out if it needs to be berries and then bring it back to corn. And so this is really about how do we build a food system of the future and put the right assets in the right market conditions, and then back to the equity piece. So yeah, I think it's not just not a twin, but we actually are dependent on each other, building the right piece in the right place together.
AG, what does this mean?
Well, I would still say, again, if you have affordable land, lower energy costs, lower water costs, you bring in technology and you have a great, robust toolbox for your pest control, that gives you an opportunity anywhere in the planet. If those are your attributes that you get to work with, the minute you're the high cost producer and you're competing with someone else that can come in and undercut you with price, and suddenly you're losing $1 a box when someone's breaking even and someone else is making a buck. That's the reality that's many of us are faced with here in California, for example, that we've gone along. We might be really good at growing a crop, but we're no longer competitive in growing that same crop because of these costs, because of regulatory burden, because of other things. And that's the reckoning that's taking place right now. So as we all scramble to try and find the crop that we can grow, or pick up our toys and our tractors and move to another area, that unfortunately is some of the reality that we're facing. I hate to be a wet blanket here in any way, but it is the reality of what most of the producers are facing throughout the country, is how do you continue to compete with other areas that can produce significantly more cheaply than we can.
We have about 30 seconds left. Can we do a speed round, bullet, one sentence? What's the one thing the Delta should be working on now to look more like California? Julie, I'm going to hit you first.
To look more like California. I had to go first. I mean, I think simply diversifying crops so that you have a greater base to build from.
John?
Platform to de-risk the investment for producers.
Pete?
Automation and transparency in the market.
AG?
Look to new food systems like the food banks, like providing your own produce for schools, and that you can create a whole new generation of growers through your FFA, through your farmers organizations, through your farm bureaus, to start to focus a new system for a different food market that allows you to ramp up your capacity.
Thank you all for your time and insights in Crusonia. Thank you so much for organizing this fantastic panel.
Thank y'all.